Path to New Life by Rebecca J. L. Chapter 1, Part 2. Shoot! Why did I tell them that? Now people are going to avoid me all the more because of how dangerous I am. I groaned and walked into the general store and bought all the spices, food, and clothing that we needed. Then I went over to the butcher store, and Ronald smiled at me happily and said, "Hello, White. Thanks for helping me." I nodded and said, "You're welcome." Then he grinned and asked, "How can I help you today?" I smiled and said, "I'd like to buy some meat if that's all right." He nodded, then asked, "How much?" I was about to answer him, but a man's voice, interrupted me. "6 deer, please." My eyes nearly bugged out of their sockets. 6 deer? On our rations, that's basically enough to feed an army. Ronald spun around and then bowed and said, "Of course, Your Highness. Will that be all?" I stepped away from the counter when I heard footsteps approaching me. I lowered my head and said with respect and a bow, "Your Majesties." The male voice, the king, lifted up my head and said, "Look at me, young warrior." I lifted up my head and Queen Marissa and Princess Rose gasped. I frowned. "What's wrong? Did I look that horrible?" The king asked, "What is your name?" I blinked, then I said, "White Dove." He nodded, then looked towards Queen Marissa and the others, then asked, "What's your father's name?" I replied, "Kurt Dove." He and the prince scowled, while Queen Marissa and Princess Rose looked horrified. My eyes widened in surprise, but I quickly hid the emotion behind a blank face. I did this because when I was young, Father had pounded it into me that emotion is for the weak. I would get in big trouble if I showed emotion. Then the king asked, "Could you take us to your house when you're done here?" I said, "Yes, Your Majesty, but you will need your horses." They nodded, and the prince left. I assumed to get the horses. While I waited, I set my things on the counter and leaned against the wall with a bored expression and crossed my arms. I pulled out one of my daggers and examined the blade. It was in good shape, so I slid it back into its sheath on my belt. A short while later, Ronald came out in several trips, and some of the king's men took the meat and left after it all was paid for. Then I bought enough meat worth $30, and I left and met the royals outside. They all were on their horses. I nodded to them, and then I began to lead the way to my house. When I reached the forest, I paused, then whistled 4 times. I repeated this one more time, and it wasn't long before the birds began to carry the sound. Queen Marissa and Princess Rose gasped in amazement, while the king and the prince listened. I tilted my head, then paused as I heard it. I turned to the right, and a few minutes later, Handsome, my black stallion, trotted out of the woods and over to me. Queen Marissa said, "Oh my!" Princess Rose said, "He's beautiful!" And I walked over to him and said, "Hello, Handsome. I don't have a carrot right now, but I will once we get home." He nickered and we all laughed. He bent and I climbed on. Then I turned to the royals and said, "This is Handsome. I've had him ever since he was a young colt." They all nodded and we continued. The closer we got to home, the quieter and more tense I got. But for some odd reason, the royals did too. Wait, where did the guard's headmaster go? Oh yeah, he didn't come with. Stupid me. I shook my head, then saw my house. The house was a 3-level house. The basement, the main level, and the attic, where we trained. Handsome stopped once outside the house, and I got off. Then I picked a carrot and rinsed it off, then I gave it to him. He neighed in delight, then ate it. Obviously, Father had heard him, because he stormed out of the house, saying, "Took you long enough, you ungrateful, lazy cow. Go pack up. We need to move. I'm tired of this place." Once he finished, he realized who else was here, and froze. Then he put on a fake smile and said, "Your Majesties, such an honor." I thought, "You are a horrible actor, Father." The king drew his sword and said, Kurt Samuels, you are under arrest for kidnapping Lord and Lady White's daughter, Dove White. And you are also guilty of murder. This crime is punishable by death. Do you deny your crime?" My jaw dropped and I frowned in puzzlement. "Father didn't kidnap or murder anyone, and his name is not Kurt Samuels." I said, "Your Majesty, you must be mistaken. Father hasn't kidnapped or murdered anyone, and his name is Kurt Dove, not Kurt Samuels." The king said to Queen Marissa, "Love, will you please explain things to her?" Queen Marissa and Princess Rose nodded and then got off their horses. That's when I noticed the men in the woods. 2 came out and grabbed Father.